I'm going to talk about conquering prematurity. Normally that's a title that is an albatross and you would blame on the organisers and say, how am I going to do it? Unfortunately, I came up with it myself, so it's all my fault. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about my research. I'm going to try and give you the big picture about stuff that we are doing in the nursery, about stuff that's happening in Australia, about stuff that's happening across the world, and I hope you find it quite interesting. So, just to give you a brief overview of what my talk's going to be, I'll briefly talk about the burden of preterm birth in Australia and focus on the outcomes of babies born too soon. And then I'm going to just talk about four things which I see as challenges to conquering prematurity. Neonatal lung disease, acquired neonatal brain injury, postnatal growth and programmed health outcomes secondary to preterm birth. So, busy slide, lots on it, and this is all data from the ANZNN. We are very lucky that we live in a country with a very well organised network of neonatal units where all our data is collected and then fed back so we know what we're doing. And this is publicly available. Some of the data I'm going to show you actually identifies women's and children's, and that's with the approval of ANZNN. But what we see is that there is a slow but steady trend in the increase in preterm birth in Australia. And it's not only in the very preterm babies, but it's also the babies who are classed as late preterms, so 32 to 36 weeks. And these are a very interesting group and often forgotten about in neonatal care. We focus on the smallest babies, but actually our biggest workload is our infants who are close to term but don't quite make it. We see that the majority of our infants admitted to the nursery are between 29 and 33 weeks gestation. And within Adelaide, we kind of follow the general trend in Australia. We have a slightly higher number of small babies, and that's because of the geographic uniqueness of South Australia and the fact that there are only 2 units, us and Flinders, who look after these babies. But the important thing is there's a distinct increase in not only the small babies but the big babies. And this is data from Lex Doyle and the group in Victoria from the women's. And what we see is that there's an increase in all preterm babies between 1991 and 2009. We don't have any more recent data, but 25% increase in all preterm birth, which is quite a scary statistic when you see how busy we are within the nursery. But the majority of the increase is actually in these later preterm infants, with a smaller increase in the smaller prems. So what about outcomes? Well, I'm pleased to say that, as Laura very nicely pointed out, we're actually quite good at what we do. The vast majority of our babies do very well, but unfortunately there are a number that don't make it through the neonatal period. And as you can see, this is very dependent upon both gestation and birth weight. And whilst overall survival continues to improve, there's been a clear shift in thinking, and it's not all about survival now. And what we're aiming for, and I think the priority of care, is survival free of significant long-term morbidity, and in particular neurodevelopmental deficit, which is now the focus of perinatal care. And Julia is going to talk about that at the end of today. There are a lot of various things that feed into that, not only gestation and birth weight, but also socio-economic factors and what we do to the babies in the nursery. Well, why is it important? Well, unfortunately, neonatal care is incredibly expensive, and there is a massive societal cost for actually quite a small number of babies. As you can see from the figure over there, as again Laura said, 25 weeks, you're looking at roughly 100 days in hospital. And a lot of our very small babies spend a significant length of time in intensive care and consume a significant amount of healthcare resource. And when you look at the cost in a monetary term of our babies, it's dependent upon both their birth weight and their gestation, but also on significant morbidity that they experience during their stay. So sepsis, brain injury, neck that we've heard about already, bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And you can see that if you have a baby less than 750 grams who makes it home to discharge, you're looking at roughly $10,000 to $20,000. If they have all four of these major complications of neonatal care, you're getting close to $125,000 to $200,000 per baby. So whilst very preterm infants account for over 30%, they do account for over 30% of all newborn health costs, it's only 1.7% of the babies that we look after, 1.7% of the babies that we look after. And potentially preventable comorbidities significantly add to these costs, in addition to increasing the incidence of chronic illness, rehospitalisation, and developmental delay. So, we have to bring it back to the baby. And as I said, it's not all about the very small preterm baby. It's about the middling preterm or the growth-restricted baby. And we also look after a fair number of big babies as well. And this is the second talk in a month that I've managed to organise the night after I've been on call. And it was big babies that kept me up all night. So neonatal lung disease. This is really kind of bread and butter in neonatology and has received an awful lot of focus. We've spent the whole week, if you watch SBS, looking at the reruns of the assassination of Kennedy. But we need to remember that Kennedy had a son in 1964, at 34 weeks, who died of RDS. And this was really a really important step in neonatal medicine because a lot of money got channeled in to research into RDS in the US, and the founding of neonatology as a specialty. We know that our little ones are born with immature airways, and Laura's research is focusing on the role of antenatal corticosteroids. But I think this is a very good example of how a disease process is changing and how we need to change our thinking about it. Because we've got this concept of old BPD and new BPD. We are only 20, 30 years into having babies less than 28 weeks old surviving to discharge home. In the 70s and even the early 80s, it was unusual for little ones at the extremes of prematurity to survive. And our understanding of the disease processes that they experience, and in particular lung disease, has now changed with the advance of neonatal care. When we look at chronic lung disease, which is the long-term consequence of BPD, we find that the rate across all the centres in Australia is roughly somewhere between 40 and 60% for infants born less than 28 weeks who survive to 36 weeks gestation. And what we see is that we now have three very distinct sets of babies. They're probably the infants with what we would classify as old BPD, who start off sick and continue to deteriorate. There are the babies who seem to do quite well and then catch us out. So at the end of the second, third week, begin to deteriorate, and this is what we classify as new BPD. And we have the babies that are always going to do quite well. And this is all down to, I think, a growing understanding of the role of inflammation, and particularly chorioamnionitis. When we look at infants less than 28 weeks, 35% of our mums who deliver will have either clinical or subclinical chorio. And although that produces a baby who is actually quite well and stable in the first few days of life, they then begin to fall to bits over the course of the first, second, third week. And the classic presentation of that is rapidly progressive chronic lung disease, ventilator dependence, positive pressure dependence on respiratory support, and the need for postnatal steroids to get them off. So not only do we need to look back, but we actually need to think about what we're now dealing with, because I would suggest that the common pathogenesis of disease that we're dealing with in the neonatal period is changing, and our understanding of the pathways that lead into it is beginning to focus more on inflammation and the role of infection, and we'll come back to that a little bit with brain disease as well. So what about neonatal brain injury? Well, this is the one that we always worry about. This is the most difficult thing to talk about with parents. Although survival free of significant morbidity is very black and white. As soon as you mention that the baby's at risk of brain injury, you invariably result in mum and dad breaking down into tears. And we know that it's very clearly dependent upon gestation and also birth weight. Again, this is ANZ and N data, and you see that there's a significant improvement in the risk of brain injury with increasing gestation, but we still have a large number of babies who are at risk of bleeding into their brain, which makes it sound very dramatic. And I think one of the major challenges in neonatal care is trying to adapt our approach to prevent that. With regards to new insights, much like chronic lung disease, and this is work that we are doing in the nursery, so this is the only bit of personal work that I'm going to show. We have begun to try and persuade people that there's this concept of unmet demand. So your brain is a metabolic organ. It's not all about blood supply to the brain, it's how the brain uses oxygen. There's certainly an important part to play with intrauterine inflammation, and this results in hypoxic ischemic injury. Coupled with that, we've got preterm babies who have a period of vulnerability and also cerebrovascular immaturity, and you end up with not one, but probably three, possibly even more pathological processes which result in either periventricular injury or intraventricular hemorrhage. And that's related to ischemia due to inflammation, excitotoxicity, which I'm not going to talk about, but also infection-induced inflammation. And this is it. This is the one bit of data I'm going to show because I'm really proud of it, and it's just about to come out. What we've been trying to do in the nursery is predict brain injury. So a lot of the stuff that we do is very good at telling parents that their baby's already injured. But what we need to do is pick the babies who are at highest risk and try and intervene. And I think that's the challenge for conquering prematurity. And what we use is various technologies within the nursery. We've got ultrasound to look at blood flow. We've got something called near-infrared spectroscopy, which we put to parents as a bit like the red light that you use in Woolies to scan your barcode, but it lets us measure oxygen supply and utilisation in the brain. And what we've managed to show is that if you combine this measure of brain metabolic activity with gestational age, we've now got a score, a marker of those babies at highest risk of brain injury. Therefore, we identify a population that we can intervene with and prevent their injury. And that might be as simple as increasing their oxygen so they have higher saturations, or it might be transfusing them so they've got more hemoglobin to carry oxygen to their brain. And this is a major step forward in neonatal care, because brain injury is a game changer for our babies. And if we can prevent it by picking those at highest risk, then we're a major step forward to improving outcome. The last thing I'm going to talk about is neonatal growth. These are real charts, and as you can see, this is birth weight. More importantly, this is head circumference, because we're interested in the brain. And these belong to this little guy who was born at 25 weeks. And growth is something that we do very, very poorly, and is a major research focus within the nursery at the Women's and Children's. And what we see is that the neonatal period is characterised by significant cumulative nutritional deficit and postnatal growth restriction. So this little guy started off on the 50th percentile, and despite everything that we tried to do to get him growing, crossed the percentiles to end up close to the third by 36 weeks. More importantly, his head circumference also faltered. And head circumference is brain growth is neurodevelopmental outcome. So both nutritional deficit and poor growth in very preterm infants are associated with significantly higher rates of poor neurodevelopmental outcome. And it seems like a really simple thing to do, improve their growth, they do better. But the next slide I'm going to show you just shows you the difficulty that we're having. So what we have here is a couple of graphs on this side which show the effect of age, postnatal age in days, on weight evolution. So all our babies grow. And then we begin to get good weight gain, and we think, that's fantastic, they're growing. But what we actually see is when you look at something called a Z-score, which normalizes their weight gain across all babies, you actually have this cumulative deficit, and it doesn't improve. So although on our charts it looks as though babies are getting better, they're getting bigger, their head's getting bigger, they're getting longer, their weight's getting heavier, with each day that passes, they're getting further and further behind the 8 ball. And what we've seen over the last 5-6 years is that people have focused on the amount of energy that babies receive in the neonatal period. And both these figures look at energy intake and protein intake. And what we found is that the recommendations for both have dramatically increased dependent upon week, depending on the year that the study was published. So the dogma is that more protein, more energy makes better babies, better growth, better head growth, better weight. And the reason I brought it up is that Jess, who's sitting here, through a really well-designed study, looking at protein supplementation in babies, has proven that you can give babies as much protein as you like, but you don't actually improve their weight gain. So it's not simple. And I think this is a really good example of the need to have directly relevant clinical questions which can be translated into practice, well-designed studies which involve not just clinicians but also basic scientists to answer questions which will have significant outcomes. So it's not all about protein, and this is now dogma. People think lots of babies, give them lots of protein, all will be well, and it's probably not true. Just to scare everybody at the end, I'd like to just very briefly talk about the lifelong consequences of being born too soon. Laura, I apologise. There's an increasing awareness of programmed health as a direct result of preterm birth. So we focus on getting the baby out of the nursery, we focus on getting them to their 1-year growth and development assessment, their 3-year growth and development assessment, to school. We've now got a population of infants who are now in their 20s, 30s, who've never existed before because they would never have survived. And we have no idea what survival was meant to their long-term health. And there's increasing evidence that not only prematurity, but certainly growth restriction, which brings in our inability to get our babies growing properly, brings it into focus. The effect of both antenatal and postnatal steroids, and certainly poor postnatal growth, has long-term consequence on metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular health, and also potentially reproductive health. So we know that mums who've had one preterm baby are at increased risk of having another. What we don't know is a girl who was born prematurely, are they programmed to have altered reproductive health? Are they programmed to have preterm babies? And these are questions that we'll only be able to answer over the next 10 to 20 years. The largest cohort in the world is the Liggins, and they are now in their 30s, and we're already seeing a group of adults with very abnormal metabolic profiles earlier than we would expect. An increased incidence of insulin resistance, increased incidence of type 2 diabetes, increased risk of heart disease. And I think this potentially is a public health problem which is going to explode over the next 10, 20, 30 years because we are actually better at what we do in the beginning. So to summarise, improving survival of very preterm infants is no longer enough. It's not adequate. We've done that. It's not good enough anymore. Our aim must be survival free of significant long-term morbidity. And that might be morbidity in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. So this is an area of research which I think the Robinson is front and centre in answering, because we have the expertise to look at intergenerational change. Changes in the pathogenesis of prematurity-related morbidities continue to challenge our understanding of disease processes. So things that we knew everything about are no longer the same anymore. The goalposts have been moved. We've got to move with them. And as such, a healthy start to life remains a critical national and international research priority. And that's really important because up until recently, that was an NH and MRC key research priority, it's no longer one. So we have to, as advocates for preterm babies, make sure that at a national and international level we push our case that it's really important that we do our best for our babies, that it's a research priority, that it's adequately funded, and that we do it properly. I'd just like to finish by thanking all our funding bodies, and particularly the Neonatal Research Group at the Robinson, the Centre of Early Origins of Health and Disease, it doesn't exist anymore, but still, the School of Paediatrics and Reproductive Health, and also my colleagues in the Women's and Children's. And thank you.